Welcome back. All right, so there are days where somebody will make a comment on the channel. I'm like, oh, I've done a video on that. And then I go look and I'm like, no. I've done a video on the career of Eric Lindros. Absolutely. Have I ever done a video specifically talking about the Quebec Nordiques and their trade of Eric Lindros? Twice they traded him. And the answer is no. I can't find a video where I specifically just dove into this and made up a big board on this. So let's go through this. So there needs to be some background on this. The Quebec Nordiques were in tough shape. Tougher shape than this gritty doll here. 87-88 it started. The dissension. They ended up with 69 points that year. They had 61 the year after in 88-89. And it was believed that that was probably bottom. Like, okay, this is bottom. It's got to get better. The following season, they had 31 points. This is while we were aware there was a young phenom coming up, Lindros. The next one, as he was being dubbed. He was really hyped up quite a bit to the point where on this 1993 yearbook, you can see Lindros there in the corner. The great 88. And there's the Lone Rangers aim for a Stanley Cup. So there's Messier, and it's 93. So they did get a Stanley Cup with Messier. And so there you go. So Lindros, it was known before the draft Lindros didn't want to go there. Now, the record 90-91, they had 46 points. So when they drafted him number 1 overall in 1991, this is after 4 disastrous seasons for the Quebec Nordiques. He didn't want to go there. But there's a lot of just different reports on where he wanted to go and why. Why is a big one too. So 91-92, they end up with 52 points, which is, I guess, an improvement. And I remember following the Nordiques at the time and going, well, at least they won 20 games this year. So Lindros is drafted at number 1. He was not going to play. He goes up. Sure, I'll shake hands. Thanks for the jersey. I'll put this under my arm. I'll go back and I'll sit down looking miserable. Absolutely miserable. And the images of him looking miserable, that was what came out of that draft weekend. And so the Nordiques were in a rough spot here. They had a player who was seen as a franchise player who had no interest in playing for the franchise that drafted him. And had made it clear before the draft, I will not play. Quebec even brought in Guy Lafleur to try to broker something, and Lafleur came out of that saying he is never playing for the Quebec Nordiques. Now, whether you believe it's his parents that influenced this decision, whether you believe it was his, whether you believe he was a prima donna and all that stuff. Now, I, at the time, was quite upset. I was like, no, you get drafted, you go to the team that drafts you. That's how this works. And I couldn't remember, and again, this is me at the time thinking, I couldn't remember a time where a top draft pick like that had ever refused to report, refused to sign, wouldn't even talk about a contract. Now, you would think that having a year of not being signed, that maybe his value would drop. If anything, his value seemed to keep going up. You'd see him playing international hockey. You'd see he could play against men. You could see he could dominate the game against men as well. And so he's NHL ready, and GMs were willing to do business here with the Quebec Nordiques. Now, Lindros, when looking at why he didn't sign, when he made it into the Hall of Fame in 2016, he said it was Marcel Aubut, that he didn't like Marcel Aubut, and he was not going to play on a team that he was president of, that he was in charge of, right? And as long as he's the owner, I'm not going there. Now, Pierre Pagé, who was the general manager at the time, disputes that. Pierre Pagé saying that he wanted to play for Keenan in Chicago, that he didn't like Gretzky, didn't want to play with Gretzky. Again, this is Pierre Pagé saying this. Didn't want to play with Gretzky in LA, he didn't like Gretzky. He didn't want to play in Philadelphia when they were talking about other teams. He wanted to play in Chicago, he wanted to play for Mike Keenan. That Lindros' mother and Keenan were classmates and knew each other. So that familiarity, he wanted to go play in Chicago. And of course, Chicago in the early 90s, knocking on the door of a Stanley Cup. They would go to a Stanley Cup final right around the time where he's drafted. So it made some sense that would be a place he'd look at and say, I want to go there. I'm surprised to look at this and see Pierre Pagé saying he wouldn't have gone to the Kings, because in the early 90s, a lot of players wanted to go to the Kings. They wanted to play with Gretzky. There was something exciting going on in California. So whether that's accurate or not, the idea he wouldn't go to play in LA does surprise me. Now, his former agent, Rick Curran, who was his agent at the time, they parted ways a few years after this takes place. backs up Lindros' version, and he says it wasn't just Marcel Aubut. It was small market. It was the way the team was being run. But yeah, Marcel Aubut was a major part of the reason why Lindros didn't want to play there. But again, for Lindros to say, well, it was just Aubut, the agent seems to be saying it wasn't just that. There were other things in negotiations that we brought up that were beyond the president or the owner of the team. And so there was this impasse, right? So Lindros, I'm not playing there. And for the Nordiques, you have a limited amount of time that you own somebody's rights, and then they become a free agent. We see it every year where a player who's been drafted doesn't sign with the team that drafted him, and he goes to free agency. And the funny thing is, we don't really make a big deal of it. There's not a lot of complaining like, what a prima donna, how dare he? You look right now at Adam Fox with the Rangers. He only wanted to play for the Rangers. So he was drafted by Calgary, he goes to Carolina, he ends up with the Rangers because he only wanted to sign with the Rangers. And so that's something that years ago would have been absolutely ridiculed. And now we say, hey, this guy wants to play. There's more respect for a team wanting to, or a player wanting to be with a certain team than there was in the early 90s. So Marcel Aubut makes 2 trades. He made a verbal agreement with the Philadelphia Flyers. So in his mind, all right, I have a verbal agreement. I'm going to tell Russ Farwell, the GM of the Flyers, he can call Eric and work on it and see if Eric will waive. I don't think they thought Eric would actually agree to sign there. I don't think that they felt that was going to happen. So they worked out a deal with the Rangers 80 minutes later. So within an hour and a half, they had so if you made this deal in the first period of a game, that means that midway through the second, you're making another trade. He was playing the EA Sports NHL games as a GM before we were. And the reported deals were kind of massive. So the reported original deal from the Philadelphia Flyers was Mike Ricci, young, exciting player. Rod Brindamore, also young, exciting player. Mark Recchi. So this is a lot of young players. Steve Duchesne, Ron Hextall, Dominic Roussel. So they would have had a starter and a backup. Multiple first-round picks, and $15 million. Because I remember thinking at the time, well, if you want to be evil, just throw a bunch of money at it too. But it just seems weird to me having money as part of it. And I can't remember the last time we saw money as a part of a trade. I'm pretty sure that that's not a thing anymore. What we do now with cap space and moving things around as close as you get to actual money changing hands. And again, the deal having to involve multi-millions of dollars doesn't help the perception that Quebec is a small market team that needs money. And this is a storyline that was out there as well. Now, again, this is verbally agreed to, and then they make a deal with the Rangers they liked better. The deal they liked better, reportedly, was Sergei Nemchinov, Tony Amonte, Alexei Kovalev, James Patrick. So you would have had 3 forwards, a defenseman, and then either Van Beesbroek or Richter, multiple first-round picks as well, and $20 million. Now, Ranger fans, think about this. Mike Richter on the Quebec Nordiques. John Van Beesbroek being the starter in 1994. Did they still win the Stanley Cup? Are they still Stanley Cup champions in 1994 with Van Beesbroek in the net instead of Richter? I would argue probably not. Richter was the better goaltender of the two. So if Richter was the one that ended up going in the Lindros deal, did they win a Stanley Cup with Lindros in that lineup? Right? Now, what's interesting is Lindros would become a Ranger later in his career. But for this video, this is about the initial trade. So the NHL, seeing Lindros traded twice, and I remember I laughed pretty hard about this because this was at the draft this takes place. So 1991 draft, he's drafted, puts the jersey under his arm, goes over, sits down, looks miserable. And then 1992, he's traded twice for basically an entire team. If both of these trades went through, basically you could build a pretty nice team from that. I do like the Philadelphia trade better. The funny thing is the finalized trade is different from this initial trade. And the Flyers were allowed to make changes because they hadn't actually written anything down. It was a verbal agreement. So basically what happens is an arbitrator comes in and says, look, the fact that the Philadelphia Flyers allowed their general manager to call Eric Lindros And get Lindros to agree to the trade means that's the trade. You can't have a GM calling the player, agreeing to a trade, and then go back and make a trade with somebody else. So the New York Rangers trade is nullified, which I think helps the Rangers win the Stanley Cup in 1994. Because again, Lindros, yes, absolutely a stellar hockey player, fantastic, helped the Flyers a lot. But I don't think the Rangers win the 1994 Stanley Cup if that trade goes through. That's just me. But again, there's some pretty key pieces there. A Monty they would turn into other pieces for that Stanley Cup. And so, yeah, that would have been a tough trade for the New York Rangers, I think, to live down. That first year, I think the Rangers would have taken a step back. And then who knows what happens from there, right? We don't have 94. We don't get the guarantee from Messier. We don't have all these great moments. And so I think it's good for the Rangers that the arbitrator ruled in favor of the Flyers. Now, what this also did was it negatively impacted, and Stephen Finn, former NHL player, when asked, said that this negatively impacted the view around the league with the players of how the Quebec Nordiques were perceived. That now it looked like they really were just this small market that couldn't attract players. Nobody wanted to be there. And I would even argue that part of the reason why the Quebec Nordiques have not returned is partly because of how all of this unfolded and how players didn't want to go there. And when the Nordiques left Quebec, it was kind of with a whimper. There wasn't a big outcry. There wasn't this, like, the amount of outrage towards Quebec leaving wasn't anywhere near what it was in Winnipeg. When the Jets left, there was a huge, huge groundswell of support for the team. A lot of grassroots movements going on to try to keep them. And I genuinely thought that maybe the Jets fans might be able to save it back in 96. But, yeah, the Nordiques in 95 when they left, it didn't feel the same. Like they would have big rallies and you'd have like 20. Again, just for me watching it on TV and watching the sports highlights, it was like, there's not that many people there. And then you'd see the Save the Jets, and it was huge. Now, maybe it wasn't well organized, or maybe fans had just said, it's done, there's nothing we could do, Marcelo Boo's moving the team. It just publicly was perceived as not a lot of fight, which again, for Bettman, might be part of what he's looking at and saying, well, they didn't fight that hard to keep the team. And again, it is interesting that the Lindros deal may have sped up the Nordiques leaving, even though the year after the Lindros deal, the Nordiques doubled their points. They went from 52 points before the trade to the year after the trade and getting all the Flyers to 104 points. This was a team that already had some good young players with guys like Sundin and Owen Nolan. And then you add those players from Philly, you can move other players out because you've acquired so much. You've acquired so many players. And look what they get. They get Ron Hextall, starting goaltender. Steve Duchesne, excellent defenseman. Mike Ricci, good young forward, can play a two-way game. Kerry Huffman, depth defenseman. Peter Forsberg, he's pretty good. So you get Peter Forsberg in the Lindros deal, and as was said, within a couple of years, we were looking at that trade and saying, you know, Lindros for Forsberg straight up might be a pretty fair trade. And then a 1993 first-round pick, which became Jocelyn Thibault. And, of course, he's part of the Patrick Roy deal to the Avalanche. $15 million is in there, plus future considerations. So if you wondered what future considerations was doing in 1992, he joined the Quebec Nordiques. This is while he was also being traded all over the place, as future considerations tends to have happen to him. But, yeah, this was a dramatic shift. The Nordiques get better as a team, but the organization's perception in the public eye drops. So it was an exciting few years after that, watching the Nordiques get better. And then they end up in Colorado, and they win a Stanley Cup in 1996, in large part, honestly, with what starts with this deal. So the pieces that aren't there for the actual Cup win in 96 are moved out in part to bring in the parts they needed. And I remember that 93 team and the playoffs that looked like they might go on a run, and then they didn't. But yeah, it was an interesting time. And Lindros went on to have a productive, controversial career with the Flyers, and then with other teams after his time with the Flyers was done, as I've talked about in a career video there. But yeah, it was bonkers. I remember when he was traded twice, and I remember saying, how does that happen? And there was a lot of debates between myself and my friends about how does a GM pick up a phone, call through and make a deal, hang up the phone, and then pick it up again and make another deal involving the same guy he just traded? Did Obu at the end of the call say, okay, so for me to, can you guys get Lindros out of Philly? Because, anyways, it was bizarre, it was bonkers, and there you go. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.